Does anybody else care for some hot sauce here? Pizza? Anybody? It's really good. Top notch. That's it.
I just didn't want to start the meeting without ourselves. There might be some new folks here who might know everybody, so start back there.
Cindy Sharman on the planning commission.
Doug Henderson, also on the planning commission.
Ian McCarter, town attorney. Miles Baker, Windsor Town Board.
Jerry Musselman, planning commission.
Ken Bennett, Windsor Town Board.
Kelly Hall, planning commission.
David Zaslowski, Town Board, District 6. Barry Wilson, Town Board, District 2.
Don Jones, Town Board, District 5.
Over here.
Melissa Berry, planning staff.
Scott Paulson, Director of Planning.
Carmen Malone, planning.
Mahar Matthew, Planning.
Dennis Wagner, engineering.
Jay Hale, Planning.
And Victor Talent, planning.
And I'm Kristen Melendez, Mayor of Windsor. So this evening, Carlin is going to get us started, and then Melissa will take over. So.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. So we're going to start out with the natural areas, and this is basically to get your feedback on if this is a good idea, just a big picture discussion on what you think so far and if staff's headed in the right direction. And then the second item, Article 5, there's more detail and more discussion on that, so just wanted to put that out there that for those two items. The first one, we're really just looking at broad brush, big picture. Is this something the board's interested in and getting some feedback there, and then jumping into Article 5. So with that, I'll turn it over to Melissa.
One other thing, we don't have a mic to pass around tonight, so we turned up the volume on the podium microphones, and we'll just try to repeat key points for the people at home.
So I think Carlin covered it pretty much what I was going to say. Basically, as you know, we're updating the development chapters of the municipal code. One of the goals of that is to hopefully have the code implement the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan. So while we're doing the update, we're looking at areas that could be added. One of those areas is protection or preservation of natural habitat or features. So there is a little bit of language in the subdivision ordinance that talks about preservation of those areas, but it gets kind of lost along the way to the site I will go into them and bring to you, but, let's face the question, is this something that you would like to entertain?
What does it mean if we have it in the code? Does it just mean that it's kind of a statement and this is that we're kind of making more or less about having it out there that has something?
Well, we currently have kind of broad brush statements in the comprehensive plan. This would be taking it to the next step and actually adopting standards that would be incorporated into our reviews. We've got a recent example of the Great Western annexation, seventh annexation?
I believe it was 7.
That we're working with them to preserve, and maybe you want to kind of give a little bit of
We've been
background.
working, went through the annexation process, we understood that as an area of not concern, but area of interest that particularly for industrial development to come up to the Park area. And Great Western has been working with staff on, they're doing a revision to their master plan as is, but to show how they could protect that area better from having a development in the area. That's an ongoing process right now.
So we're kind of working with them on a voluntary basis right now.
Right. So that would be standards where people would have to meet that everybody.
Would it make it maybe hard, because, right now, there's been some, while subtle, there has been some conversations on each end of some of that big, large open space. There's been some, I think, I would just call them startup conversations, right? So to the east, we've been chatting with maybe Greeley and some folks, and to the west, we've been talking with Larimer County and Youth Outdoors. We've had some conversations in meeting, but one, I don't know, maybe sometime later this year, the board, we could have an update. I don't know where either of those pieces are or where they're at, if any of that conversation, but I know some of the conversations that I've been part of, I just would want to make sure that whatever we're putting in here doesn't inhibit or make it harder for some of those folks who right now are looking at what they need to do, be able to accomplish and get some of those things done that they need to do in order to make those land requirements, et cetera, et cetera.
What would happen currently, let's say the Tiger Pit area, to me that seems like an open space. Is it currently park space? Is that how, if we don't do some sort of preservation, is there another designation that it currently?
I don't know the current designation right now. You said the Tiger?
Tiger.
Okay. I'm not sure
It's a park site.
it's a park site.
And, yeah, it's the water storage pit on the north side of Main Street.
So would it be allowed to be developed beyond that, so it's just park site?
It's a park site right now, so there aren't anything beyond park
So
development.
right now, the only thing, if they did develop as a park site, planning may weigh in and ask for some areas to maybe not be taken out of the natural state. But if you're just working department to department, then it wouldn't be a regulation of what you have to do. Right now, we don't have anything in the code saying we need to be set back from a creek edge or something like that.
So what if we're in some sort of buffer space between our neighbor communities? What would that, currently, we don't do this, what would we zone that?
Well, this doesn't specifically get into community separators, or at least we haven't gotten there yet tonight. We're just trying to get, I guess, feedback from the board as to, is that something we want us to try and address? Or, I think the draft that Melissa's working on has standards that are borrowed from other jurisdictions.
Let me ask it this way, so pretend we don't have Starbucks right now, and they're gonna go right on the highway. What's different when they develop that Starbucks with this new standard?
Well, it hasn't been fleshed out totally, but we have some ideas from looking at other communities. So in this way, we have the habitat areas or areas of interest to be protected, like the river corridor, and we have it on the map. If the property is within a certain distance of that feature, then it would trigger in another layer. And what we're looking at right now, which hasn't been totally fleshed out yet, is to have just have those items mapped on the site plan so that we can you know, that this is a habitat area, or this is the river portal, or something on the site plan itself, that we know that's there. And then we would probably do some kind of like a buffer, that, okay, if you're on the edge of the creek, you need to be 20 feet back, instead of any closer than that.
So, so this would be residential and commercial?
But right now, we were thinking of multifamily, yes, but single family, not to involve them, not include them. And then we were also discussing whether or not to have any of the projects that have some kind of vesting already, or maybe even some master planning already in place, that it might not be triggered to follow
It'd
this,
have to be
since they've gotten a little farther down the line, they're not coming in fresh. But those are still items that.
What other communities have this, have something like what you're proposing?
We've done a lot of research, and there are quite a few. I mean, and the thing is that they range from everything from a statement that says preserve and protect, to all the way to XYZ, you're mapping everything, and you have, you know, reports done, and then setbacks. And then other communities do overlay zones, which is may change the uses allowed, but those are just various ones. But you know, Greeley has them, Fort Collins has them, most of them down the Front Range have them, from some extent to another. And then there's some other communities in Colorado that we're looking at for good examples.
But once if we even adopted something and had it in place, it wouldn't prevent somebody from, if they needed to, do a conditional use grant, if for some reason they had to do,
Right.
or requested to do something above and beyond or different than what we had set up.
We'd have to build in some process for those unique aspects, that if somebody's proposing something that's within a buffer area, there'd have to be some kind of escape valve to.
And would we allow paths in those? Like, I'm just thinking like Cougar River Trail, other improvements that we really like to get right along the river.
Right.
So what would be development, what would we allow, what would we prohibit?
I think there could be a series of things that could be allowed. Trails is probably something that people, I mean, you still might want to look at it, where you're putting it versus just any trail can be there. There might be other things like some level of uses that could be there, but, and I don't have my page in front of me, so I can't give you rattle off of a number of them, but trails would be one probably. There might be a gazebo or something, some use of the area that they can still use it, but their main building's not going to be, to some extent, not that they can't have a large building, but they'd have it somewhat offset off of the area that's trying to be preserved.
So we pulled together, oh, go ahead.
Just to make sure I'm kind of understanding the approach, I think what you're saying is we currently have loose language in our comprehensive plan address that says these are things to report to the town. You're wanting to codify that, or asking should
Or
we
do
codify?
correct, do some kind of standards that would help protect those natural features that are identified as valuable in our comprehensive plan.
But assuming it's an ordinance, would that only apply to certain pieces of property? Or how does it interplay with,
Well-
as the mayor said, a conditional use grant application?
Well, I think-
Do we need to weigh whether or not it's going to impact natural habitat or birds?
Well, I think with the conditional use grant, it can be considered along with that conditional use grant. If it's some kind of use that could be outside, like a buffer area or something, because it's outside, they can still use the property in its initial use, but it's not, you know, encroaching, say, within like 20 feet of the habitat area, that they can still do it. We're just trying to have the site plan be more compatible with those features that we want to have. And for, I've started on this way. One thing is that we do have some mapping of this already. I mean, the comp plan has a natural environment kind of map that we can use. And if a property is within a certain area that or touching that or covering that, then that's when it would be triggered. It wouldn't be every property having to do this. It'd be those that are already known to be within a certain area or distance from that feature that we want to preserve.
But if it's not codified, can we enforce it? Or does it have to be codified?
We could do guidelines, they're a little, we'd have to have support, that if staff is asking for this, that, go to Shane and say, why is staff making me do this, it's not a standard or code language. but if we have staff support, we could do it through a, some kind of guideline, some kind of other standards that's not codified. So we could also try to do the standards, if they are codified, with some route or method that if they have some issues, like if they want to modify, say, a buffer area over in one area for a shorter buffer area in another area, that we can have that built in, that they can give us some flexibility. It may, for example, one of the communities that I looked at has a process where if you want to go within a buffer area, you just do a report that shows that you're not going to negatively impact the area. And it might be just how to have whatever level condition the habitat's in right now, if it's already gravel area, it's habitat anymore, then perhaps it works that we can approach those areas.
I mentioned this at CUG, and in particular, I think about oil and gas development as being even a distress point that we all kind of struggle with, and how and what role it has in the community. If we have similar ordinance that says that you have to preserve and protect natural areas, et cetera, and it's codified as a standard for the town, and then you similarly have CUG standards. I know right now, the town has limited ability to impose requirements on oil and gas development, but that may change. How will this interplay then between industrial development and protecting the environment? If they're both sitting there as codified guidelines, my fear is it will create avenues or a way for anyone to challenge a conclusion that we make on a CUG saying it's inconsistent with your adopted regulations in this area.
Interesting. Particularly oil and gas CUGs.
I'm just saying it's something that someone's going to care enough about that they're going to look for a way to challenge.
We can work with Ian and see if, make sure that we have an idea that it's not conflicting, or that if we at least can get a little bit ahead of ourselves and saying, well, we're not going to, with those, but we have to, okay, then we could maybe, well, we can't change the CUG, right, for the oil and gas CUG, but we can add it to the other kinds of CUGs, of that kind of consideration.
And so at this point, we've just pulled together some concepts that we've been looking at, and before we go too far down one path, we just wanted to see if the town board and planning commission are, okay with us bringing something along these lines back to you for consideration and further direction, so that way, I guess we just didn't want to bring it out of the blue, and we just wanted to get some general feedback tonight. We definitely have to have those conversations about how things coexist with statutory requirements for oil and gas and other types of uses like that.
I understand the devil's always in the detail, and we have to have some flexibility because there's going to be unique situations, but I'm very supportive of the concept. And I'm wondering if it ties in any way to some of the conversations we've had regionally about maybe buffers between communities, whatever that might look like, or maybe some of our gateways might be an area where we do something more of a natural state. So I see this as an opportunity to maybe tie in some other things we've talked about also.
So yeah, we've heard from a couple of you, the community separators, if we can fold that into this language. I think it also plays a role with the MS4 regulations that engineering's working on. So I think we might be able to incorporate aspects that complement both of those strategic planning goals. I guess that's, the devil's in the details, and we haven't got the details yet. So.
But I think the concept is absolutely worth pursuing. I mean, we have this beautiful asset in our community called the Cooter River. I don't know if we're getting as much benefit out of that as we could. So maybe it's more of a, whatever we do with that, I think there's some opportunities to do more with the Cooter River. Also, we still have some open spaces that can be natural areas. So I think it's well worth looking into.
So, kind of a general consensus. Okay.
Great, thank you.
Oh, sure.
So I'm going to try and talk into the microphone so we're catching this for the folks at home. I apologize in advance. This is a fairly long presentation. There's a lot to cover, and I want to make sure you have the necessary details. Also, the handout is the same as the presentation on the screen. I was afraid you wouldn't be able to read it, so you've got it in front of you as well. So before I really dive in, just want to reiterate what the purpose of not just Article 5, but the entire land use code, what's the purpose of this update? It's kind of threefold. One is to reflect the contemporary development standard or development trends we're seeing in Colorado and across the country. Number two is adding some additional flexibility for different types of development. And then thirdly is implementing the comprehensive plan. So Article 5 establishes the zone districts and lot standards for lots or parcels within those zones. So that covers things like setbacks, building height, lot coverage, things of that nature, lot size. Currently, the municipal code, the zone districts really apply a single standard to each zone district, regardless of the type of use or other considerations. So things like lot size, open space, setback are all uniform throughout a zone district. What's proposed is getting away from that a little bit and getting into where we look at the building type proposed and the access to that building type, and those dictate more the standards. So, and that recognizes the unique context of different developments. It's also a direction that a lot of municipalities have been heading recently. Longmont and Loveland recently updated their codes and have a similar organization to their standards. So when I talk about building types, I mean, is it a single-family house, an apartment, commercial building, townhome, etc.? And then when I talk about access type, I'm referring to how the site is accessed by vehicles. So it could be for a single-family home, you could have a garage off the street, which is a predominant form we see, or you could have an alley in the back, or if it's a townhome, you could have kind of a shared private drive providing access to the units. So there's lots of different access types, and these are just examples of some of those access types. So when you put the access types and the building types together, it kind of gives you a menu of development options. In most zone districts, the access types and building types are fairly homogeneous. For example, the SF1 or single-family zone district is predominantly single-family homes. You might have a school or a park or things like that, but you don't have industrial or commercial uses within there. So this doesn't really come into play for those zone districts. Where it does come into play more is our current RMU zone district and some of the new zone districts where you do have more of a mix of different uses, different building types. The example of residential mixed use, our current zone, RMU, it was created to allow a mix of uses and a mix of dwelling types within a single zone. It's kind of become the default zone district for residential development in town because it does provide a great deal of flexibility to developers. They can come in with a master plan that generally shows the location of a commercial area, multifamily, without having to have the exact details dialed in. And they don't have to come back later to rezone it. So it does give them a great deal of flexibility. So what we're looking at now is creating a second RMU zone district, which would be RMU2. And that would provide additional flexibility in land development that's consistent with the comprehensive plan. The intent would be allowing a greater mix of dwelling types, the ability to create smaller lots, and more mixed-use development. So the existing RMU zone district would become RMU1. It would remain in place and would remain largely the same with some small tweaks, but we'll get into those later. So focusing just on the RMU2 at the moment, that would allow the higher intensity development, such as the smaller lot sizes and mixed-use neighborhood centers, and I'll show you some examples of these later. And this is a model that's been used in the Raindance development, where they've gone to smaller lot sizes, and they have provided a lot of additional amenities as a sort of trade-off. So smaller lot sizes is something that would be pretty new to Windsor. The standard lot size is 6,000 square feet currently. There are a few instances of smaller lots, and this is for single-family homes. The example now on the screen is Water Valley. They do have some lots around 4,200 square feet. And this is just an example of what they look like. This particular example is front-loaded, meaning the garages are off the street. And just to run through some other examples, this is well, back up for a second. So there are, when you get to the smaller lot size, there can be additional challenges. So we do want to have enhanced standards for those smaller lot sizes to address some of the concerns. And the purpose of these smaller lots is to try and respond to market demands, as well as especially considering the costs of land and water today, and also providing a variety of housing types. So I do want to get into the weeds a little bit on this smaller lot sizes, just because it is new to Windsor, and I want you to be aware of, how it would work and what it would look like. So a few more of those examples. This is one in Loveland. It's about a 4,000 square foot lot, and it has rear alley access. Another example, this one is in Fort Collins. This is a, thanks. Yeah. So this is a Fort Collins example, an 85-foot by 40-foot wide lot. Again, it has a rear alley access. And this next one is from Aurora, and it's also an 85 by 40-foot lot with a front access off the street. This particular example isn't necessarily the worst example, but I wanted to point out how what can happen on the smaller lots. You end up with a streetscape that's really dominated by the garage and the driveway, which perhaps doesn't convey the sense of quality that we would expect in Windsor. These particular houses, they do appear to have, nice finishes, and, they have brick and looks like cement siding, things of that nature. But it kind of presents a monotonous streetscape. Other challenges with these smaller lots, and we've run into this with Raindance, and we've kind of been working through them as subdivisions, the different filings have been platted, is really just fitting all the infrastructure and improvements onto the lot. So when you have utility lines, water, sewer, cable TV, etc., you need to have certain spacing between those. You have potentially street light and street trees. So it can be a lot to fit, as well as the driveway. So it's just something to be aware of. And if we go in this direction towards the smaller lots, we would want to find out best practices for avoiding issues where something gets built and there's conflicts between utilities or things.
And Paul, before you move on, can you identify some of the aesthetic challenges with some site constraints? I guess my question is, when it comes to Windsor's population, we kind of know our density numbers, right? A lot of zoning is 4 units per acre, whatever that is. So would this change that, or would this just be more of a cluster development where we have more open space instead of here?
It could be some of both. I think sewer is always going to be a limiting factor, so potentially you could get a higher density, but I don't anticipate it being monumentally, higher density. I think that's another effort that some of our department's been working on, kind of what's that build out look like, and we need to if we want to go in this direction, I think that's additional research we need to do.
I just think mechanically for the board, I mean, when we talk about our population and we're gonna show you some forecasts based on, just kind of what's zoned and what's forecast, but any effort to do higher density, right, is working a little bit against that. So I think we wanna be careful, you know, maybe if we are doing higher density, at least have that come out as more dedicated open space somewhere, or something else where we still end up with the same number of units per acre, versus, you know, doubling our units per acre, and like, oh, great, you know, now our build-out's 200,000, what the heck did we do? You know, so we just want to be cognizant of how we do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's kind of a balancing act as well with developers wanting the smaller lot sizes. They'll tell you they can offer a more affordable product, but if they can't get the extra density, then they can't offer that. But it's a trade-off for sure.
What does that got to do to it? Well, first off, what is our build-out rate now? I know it's changed from when we first started. Do we have a build-out rate for what we feel we're going to be full here?
Well, the town board had a discussion of the strategic plan sessions earlier this year, and the number that was identified as a target would be 60,000 population.
We're at 45,000.
Yeah, you know, based on our land use map, unrestricted growth, we ran the calculations years ago, and at the growth management area and the densities that we show on the land use map, we could reach up to 100,000 population. That's not getting into the details and taking out undevelopable property like floodplain, but it's a broad brush number, and I think town board with conversations about water and other limiting factors identified 60,000 population as a target, and I think we'll be having additional conversations about how to actually get to that number in the best way possible.
It's gonna be, you know, part of the conversation starting to come up, you know, I think being more proactive with community separators, I think maybe being less active with water acquisition, you know, after this, are we done? You know, are we done accommodating growth? So you know, we're gonna have all these conversations of, you know, or the things we can do as a town to be a little bit, show a little more foresight and kind of time that destiny. So I just think, you know, really saying really high density development feels counter to that vision, unless there's an offset, unless we're offsetting it somewhere else. So which is, you know, thinking deeper about it.
So the rain dance example, there,
I was just going to say, so along with this high density, we're going to maintain our standards on our streets and our lists and stuff like that. We're not going to, because I know we tried a couple of different things down by the school there, by the elementary school, where we narrowed the roads a little bit, and that, remember we could park on the roads? That was what Giorgiona.
Oh, yeah, that project is not the direction we're heading. That's a very old project, but you're showing how long you've been on the planning commission.
Yeah. That was one I always considered one of our failures.
Yeah, no, that's not we have amended the street standards, but we did not go to that extreme.
That's all. Thank you.
Well, in the chart where it talks about maximum lot coverage, those percentages, does that include driveway space, or is that just the structure itself?
it's everything that's impervious, so driveway, house, patio.
Okay. And then what is the current side setback for single family?
It's currently 5 feet.
Okay, so that's not a change?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
And that reflects the building code.
Well, you say this is happening in Rain Dance now, looked like it happened in Water Valley as well. And was it by virtue of the PUD zoning that they were allowed to reduce these, because this isn't ordinance yet?
Correct, Rain Dance exactly was a PUD, and it was a trade-off of kind of that extra open space for smaller lots. And I guess one last thought on the rain dance example is, if you look at their overall density and compare it to a lot of developments, it's not a lot higher. It is kind of the concentrated. They've got the smaller lots, but they do have a golf course and a lot of open space and trail networks.
That's the density trade-off I talked about.
Yeah.
In some ways, I don't have the meeting we're gonna have, but I think in a lot of ways, that's good. You know, if we are going, as long as these neighborhoods don't feel really built out and they come at you, I think that may be another way to really look at these subdivisions is they do have the open space and more cluster development, you know, maybe it's not gonna feel as big, like there's just houses everywhere, so, you know, I think this concept and what's going on there is something we should maybe look to say, wow, this, I don't know, this is one appropriate at that. We just want to think about this ultimate density, what we end up.
So Paul, if Rain Dance and Water Valley currently have dense housing because it was part of the PUD, and I think what you're saying here is this RM2 would really be another option for that type of development without requiring a PUD. Why would we need the other option? Is there a size, does the PUD only make sense for a certain size development? Why couldn't the developer still use the PUD approach if they wanted denser housing, since obviously that works?
Yeah, we're trying to get away from a PUD for a number of reasons. From the developer's perspective, it's more upfront time, money, effort to get it approved. From the staff perspective, it's similar, where it's a lot of negotiation back and forth just to get it before Planning Commission and Town Board for potential approval. And once it is approved, it has its unique set of standards that creates a lot of additional staff time that's necessary on the back end. For Rain Dance, for example, Robin Volner's our permit technician. Every permit that comes in, she has to refer to Rain Dance for its unique standards. So best practice is to try and get away from the PUD. And I'm going to talk more about PUD later, but yeah, it's a good question of why, is it needed? So we think there's a good reason for it.
Well, and I just think the thing to keep in mind is, can we achieve through other codes, things like Rain Dance and Water Valley, can we build in enough flexibility to still achieve that with the code, or do we need the PUD? You know, if we want to, don't want to marry ourselves and be hard and fast to it, but it is, especially as we get larger and larger, to have staff to try to administrate the PUD is problematic, you know, so I think we just need to find what's the right balance, you know.
I guess I'll go back. I think one of our other meetings, we asked the question, what's the problem we're trying to solve? This seems to be an approach that would open the door for more dense development. Is that a goal? I mean, is there a reason we should be trying to do that? Is that a direction the town wants to go, I guess?
Yeah, if you look at the comprehensive plan, it doesn't necessarily say we want to be higher density. It's about providing different options and different housing types. Some are large lots, some are smaller. So it's not as, so there's different price points, entry points where, you know, young families can afford to buy, and more workforce housing. So I think it's about providing that diversity, and the goal is not to create higher density overall. It is maybe the concentrated density.
So part of our effort, as we look at that map and think about where zoning is applied, would we then be designating this is an RM2, this is RM1 over here, or?
That would be proposed by the property owner. So what we're trying to do with the RMU2 is make it an attractive option that the developer may want to use RMU2 zoning, rezone their property that, so that they can take advantage of the different flexibility, different product types they can offer. And if we can get 99% of the development done that way with RMU2, then the need for the PUD is a lot less, and we may not have it used all that much in the future. But it is intended to be something that the property owner can take advantage of. It's not something that we would impose
And I think we'd also have sort of guidelines for where that zoning is appropriate. If it's a more, remote piece of property outside the center of town without great utilities, where road access probably is more of an estate type development. So I think there would be certain guidelines for where it's applied.
But again, Paul, I think if you're developing in your, say, way up Cameron, or 15th Street, I still think if it's a cluster development that allows for a lot of open space, the open space that we really haven't budgeted to buy, I still think it's, if there's a trade-off, or if there's a density trade-off, and we can create more open places in town, I don't know that I would live in it. I think if it's used right, it can be a tool that really kind of gets us where we want to go. I just want the trade-off to be twice as much density for open space, because we're not, gonna end up with a community we want to live in.
So one thing we had considered is the open space requirements. If you make it too high for an RMU2 type development, no one's going to want to utilize that. So more focusing on quality of the open space of, is it the river corridor, or if you're providing parks, it doesn't have to be a huge park, it has to be a park with amenities that people want to use. So trying to focus on that. So the next slide is some of the enhanced standards that would be proposed with RMU2.
Excuse me, Paul.
Yeah.
Question about what you just talked about. Let's change something about trade-off. Higher density, I can see that has a lot of advantages if there's some trade-offs. Economically, for a developer, I've been told, and one of my questions is this true, that if I build a home next to a trail, next to an open space, the value of that home is greater. So I'm just wondering if that's true, how do the economics work out? I mean, I can see a developer might want to just build a home on every piece of edge land they got. But economically, do these trade-offs work economically? That's what I'm asking.
I think it's a reasonable assumption, yes, that's a higher value of land next to a trail or a park. I guess I wouldn't be able to answer kind of the economic trade-offs of what works for a developer and what doesn't.
The staff have reached out to the development community, and they are going through these, because I think it's a fair question, and it's really not, it's not for us to say. I think
Right,
it's for developers to
can
say.
it work?
I think that's really what we're trying to find is what is that? If they can do it in higher density, they have fewer utilities to run.
Right.
They have those roads to build, there are savings there.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of finding that fair balance of, when a developer can say, okay, yeah, I can make money here, this works for me, and we see the community benefit on the backside.
So let's see. Part of the trade-off is the additional park space, more pedestrian-oriented design, which includes a mix of uses so people can walk to those amenities that are nearby, as well as some other enhanced standards such as detached sidewalks on local streets. When you want to get under a certain size lot, in this case 4,000 square feet, it would require the rear alley access, just because it gets so hard to provide everything on that lot if you don't have the alley access, and you end up with nothing but garages on a street. And then similar on the 4,000 to 6,000 square foot lots, those would have some standards for the garages or design where garages recessed from the front of the house or angled, where it's the image on the left where it's a side-loaded garage. Some of that mix of uses I talked about, or mix of dwelling types, that would be required, where you have to have a minimum of 20% out of 2 out of 3 categories. So one category would be single-family duplex, or a cottage type, which is essentially a small single-family. Category B would be townhomes. Category C, multifamily, such as apartments. So making sure there is that mix of use types, or dwelling types. And then also a requirement for a minimum amount of commercial development. Proposed is 5 acres commercial if the development's less than 200 acres, 10 acres for those over 200 acres. And again, that's about providing the amenity services that residents can walk to and have easy access to. So an example of the neighborhood center, and this is an optional component that an applicant could designate on a master plan. It would allow them to create kind of the Main Street type feel with the buildings close to the street and the on-street parking. And there'd be some standards that go along with that to ensure how it develops.
I got a question. I'm reading the script that was in the packet, page 3. It talks about the development of less than 200 acres. It says there would be a minimum commercial acreage of 5 acres. So that implies that we would require that, but we just said it would be optional. So
Right, so
I don't
the
understand what we're talking
commercial is a required component.
about. Okay.
How it develops, there's this optional neighborhood center where it's more of a compact downtown feel.
Okay, how they do it is optional.
Right.
But the proposal is that if it's 200 acres, it'd be 5%. I can't remember the criteria, but we require a certain amount of commercial acreage within the development.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
I guess fall in that same area, because I had some questions on that as well. You referenced the minimum of 20% of the 2 different categories of,
Yeah.
2 out of the 3 categories of housing types. Is it 20% each of 2 of them? 40% residential, one way or another, or 20% in total of the 2 out of 3?
20% of the residential would be
2 out of 3.
2 out of 3.
So it's 20% minimum residential. It could be then 80% commercial.
No, it's,
What's the 80% that isn't residential?
right.
You're saying
This is-
2 of the options have to be at least 20%.
Right.
Single
Yes.
family,
They each, 2,
multiplex or multifamily.
So you're 40% residential?
Yeah, so 40% minimum residential
So then the other 60 would be commercial or open space?
or resident. Yeah, or residential.
Yeah.
I think what he's saying though is that you couldn't have it be 85% one category, because then you're not hitting that minimum of 20% of a second category.
Yeah, I was really
Yeah.
curious what the other 60% gets to be.
I mean, current market, it would be residential. That's where the hot demand is. So that's kind of why we're trying to require at least some minimum amount of commercial. Yeah. So kind of pivoting from that, the RMU2 zone, I'm going to get into some of the other zone districts. So SF1 and SF2 are both current existing zones. We're not proposing any major changes to SF1 other than some changes to setbacks and things I'm going to get to later. SF2, I think the reason for that is it allows duplexes, but a developer could request the RMU zone, and they would have the option to do duplexes and everything else. So there's really no incentive or reason for them to request the SF2. So what we're looking at doing is overhauling the SF2 to be similar to the RMU2, but at a lesser intensity, where you could not have apartments. It would just be kind of single-family, duplex, townhome, that level of intensity, and without the required commercial component. So this might be appropriate closer to some existing neighborhoods that don't want to see higher intensity development. So so that's the summary of SF2. Kind of
You said we don't have anything currently under SF2?
correct.
Why wouldn't we just get rid of it then and just, I mean,
I think,
again, I think part of what we're trying to do is in some ways simplify, right? And
Yeah.
look at how we can integrate some of these things And so if we're not utilizing it, and if we've got something else that can take the place of it, why would we just maybe eliminate it?
And this would be available for smaller parcels. So the RMUs that he was describing, the really large subdivisions, the SF2 is redesigned so it could address an infill project or a smaller site.
We did look at eliminating SF2, and we decided to keep it and really change its focus as the lower intensity to the RMU2 in places where that intensity might not be appropriate. So the changes proposed to multifamily are pretty straightforward. Currently, we do have 2 multifamily zones, MF1 and MF2. There's really no difference between those two in terms of, there's a small difference in the density allowed. Right? The districts lacked clear intent statements of where one is appropriate and the other might not be. And they don't serve a whole lot of purpose of having the 2 zone districts. So we have proposed combining those into a single multifamily zone. And it would offer the same kind of menu of development options like the RMU2 I discussed. Some of the changes are some of the lot standards, the front setback, reducing it to 15 for a front entry feature. So that's could be a front porch, it could be like a covered entry of some sort. Side and rear setbacks, proposing just going to 20-foot or a standard number rather than currently it's 6 inches of setback for every 1 foot of height. The lot open space, trying to simplify that, and it's based on the building type rather than one number, rather than kind of a one-size-fits-all number for all development types. And then lot size, also tweaking those a little bit to be reflective of contemporary design trends.
Can you clarify the difference between the multiplex and the multifamily?
Yeah, great question. So the multiplex is intended as I've seen it referred to like a mansion home, where it kind of has the appearance of a large single family home, but there might be 3 or 4 apartments within it. So it's designed to kind of fit in more with a neighborhood, and the multifamily is more of a traditional apartment complex. So the estate zones, similar to the multifamily, we proposed combining the E1 and E2 into a single estate zone. E2 was originally intended to allow septic systems on 2.5 acre lots. The town has gone away from that and no longer allows septic on new developments, so there's really not a reason to keep the estate zones. Another component of the estate zones is the conservation subdivisions, which are, let me back up. The minimum lot size in a state is 1 acre. You can get smaller lots if you set aside additional open space. I think the most prominent example I'm aware of in town is Fossil Ridge, also known as Belmont Ridge, as an example that utilized that technique where I think they have around 6,000 square foot lots in their neighborhood area, and then they do have large tracts of open space with trails and other amenities. Currently, there's not a whole lot of incentive for a developer to use this when they have other zone districts that the town board is willing to rezone the property to. If and we've talked about density quite a bit tonight, and I think it's going to be a parallel kind of separate effort to get into this more, but estate zoning with the conservation subdivision can be a valuable tool of limiting development, but still concentrating it, as we've talked about elsewhere. So this is currently in the code. We're not proposing to overhaul that. We are making some changes around the edges to add more clarity to what's expected in those types of subdivisions. But again, I don't see this being a widespread tool unless it's part of a larger conversation where we want to kind of go that direction, where maybe the periphery is more estate development. So residential rear setbacks is another item we've looked at amending. The current setback is 5 feet from the rear, and this can be problematic due to how close it would allow a rear neighbor to build an addition or put a 2-story garage or something of that nature. They can go up to 35 feet, and it could really impact privacy of your rear yard. We initially had proposed changing this to 15. That would be more in line with most regional jurisdictions. After getting some feedback from some of the stakeholders, we landed on proposing 8 feet that would align with currently what we require for utility easements in the back of a newly platted lot. So it's not an area you can really build in anyway with that utility easement. So having those 2 in line makes a lot of sense. So one number isn't giving you a false impression. And it's just the 3 additional feet, but we feel it could give you a little more privacy. And this isn't a problem we've necessarily run into. We haven't necessarily had complaints about this occurring. Someone putting a big addition on the back of their house right next to a rear yard, but we could potentially see it being an issue. So we wanted to try and address it as we could.
Paul?
Yeah.
Is there, I mean, 8 feet still seems pretty close for someone to build a 2-story addition.
Mm-hmm.
Could you do bigger for a 2-story and smaller, like 8 feet for a 1-story? And maybe 15 for a 2-story?
Yeah, we can look at that. It's nice to have one standard to tell homeowners this is, not adding that complexity. That kind of standard, it's a lot easier to do on more of a multifamily where it's more seasoned kind of developer, but it's a good concept. We could look into that.
And is anybody building right now at 5 feet? Is that?
New builds, traditionally, I haven't seen them. I'm not sure what Rain Dance has planned.
But right now, they're not doing that, they're just building 5 feet.
I haven't seen that.
But someone could build an addition to their home.
Right, the concern is more in the addition, yeah.
So then where did you hear pushback on, increasing it?
The development community we shared the draft with, they had concerns with increasing it to 15.
But they're not even building there currently.
Correct.
I wonder what their concern is if they're not building.
I think they just want to keep the option open. Another change is the open space or lot coverage associated with development. I've tried to illustrate here. This is a home in Water Valley on Vineyard Drive. This is approximately 60% lot coverage. Currently required 3,000 square feet of livable open space, which is not a particularly well-defined term. So we're moving away from that just to what's the lot coverage. And the 3,000 penalizes the smaller lots as it requires a larger percentage. So going to a percentage is consistent with what most jurisdictions require. And we're looking at setting that in the 60 to 65% range. The example here is around 60%. And when you get much higher, you really lose the feel of the single family kind of neighborhood with landscaping and lawn, and end up with a lot of building and not a lot of green space.
So to Cindy's question earlier, so when we're talking about lot coverage, we're talking about anything that's impervious.
Correct,
So
yes.
house, driveway, so it's 40% has to be grass, shrubs, rocks.
Right. Another change we're looking at introducing is the minimum lot width. The town does not currently have this standard for any zone district. The idea behind that is not wanting lots that are created that are either undevelopable, they're so small. People generally avoid that. They know they need lots of a certain size, but we have run into that in certain subdivisions. They're so small, inevitably they have to come back and replat and combine with lots. But it's also to ensure adequate driveway spacing. and kind of consistency and compatibility within the neighborhood. So what's proposed is a 45-foot lot width generally, and that would be measured at the front setback, so at 15 or 20 feet. And that does allow for cul-de-sacs, which is kind of the tightest fit. So I looked at examples in Windsor, and that 45 does work with cul-de-sacs. We would propose going down to as narrow as 35 feet on those kind of in the RMU2 situations for the more compact development. But again, you would need to propose or include alternative access, such as through an alley or having a narrow, a one-car garage or something of that nature, where it's not just 35 feet and 20 of that's driveway, garage, and then your front door. Just trying to avoid that model. Yeah.
Does the old standard of 900 square feet in the MF1, does that pretty well translate to the 80%? Is that pretty comparable, or are we making a change there?
Yeah, so what we're going to do on that one is the 80% corresponds to the 20% required landscaping, and I think we'll have a separate requirement for multifamily projects that they provide kind of an amenity open space, tot lot or some green space. So that could kind of be an additional standard that's covered elsewhere.
It seems like pretty high, 80%.
Right. I think in practice it'll have to be less.
Hey, Paul, before you leave residential,
Uh-huh.
just getting back to RMU versus PUD. Now, you said staff doesn't like PUD, because there's a lot of back and forth negotiations. But to get these varied densities, you know, that density credit, whatever you want to call it, you're going to have to enter into some negotiations. And does RMU allow for negotiations for this same kind of thing? Or are you still faced with the same?
Yeah, the intent is to take that negotiation out, and here are the standards. If you meet these criteria, then you can do this higher intensity development in exchange for these other additional park space, things of that nature. So it's aiming to take negotiation out of it.
Okay, and then you talk about stakeholders you run this by. Is that developers, or would that be developers, builders, real estate people?
Good question.
Or strictly developers?
Yeah, I forgot to mention in more detail what that outreach looked like. So we did the comprehensive plan update in 2016, and that was really a highly involved outreach effort of trying to get everyone input from as many people as we could. And that was taken into consideration in the comprehensive plan. The outreach for this, where we're really trying to implement the comprehensive plan through these regulations, wasn't as wide-reaching. So for this, as an initial draft, we sent it to kind of our most frequent developers and their consultants, and wanting their initial feedback on this. And so after getting their feedback and your feedback tonight, we'd send that out to a wider audience for any input prior to bringing it back for adoption.
One other question before we move past residential. So the conversation that was happening about the overall density, I mean, if we've got a development that, let's just say it's gonna be all single-family dwellings, and currently this plot of land, under current standards of a minimum of 6,000, could hold, let's say, 100 homes. But then we apply the higher density, and now all of a sudden it can hold 175 homes. Is there something, because I know we got the, 85 some pages of the actual code that, kind of glance through but haven't read in detail. Is there something in there that's actually codifying that you can do these smaller lots, but there actually has to be this greater open space to preserve that overall density? Or are we setting ourselves up to say, we hope they'll put in the, that they'll still do 100 smaller homes and then the rest of it open space, but.
Yeah, good question, and kind of hitting on Dr. Jones' point as well about, is there going to be negotiation trying to get that open space? And so, not included in tonight's work session and packing materials are the subdivision standards. So, and those are still in draft form as well. What's proposed in those is that we would implement an open space requirement with subdivisions. Certain percentage of land needs to be dedicated as open space, set aside as open space. So yeah, we are looking at having standards for that.
I said, would we define a golf course as open space? Well, when it gets put in there.
So a golf course would not be counted as open space. I think there would be a number of categories. The most common that would come to mind would probably just be the green belt or natural area that's not highly developed, where it's an amenity for all residents that may have trails through it. But we would also potentially want to give credit for so we're not double dipping essentially. If they're dedicating parkland, we could count that. If they're providing amenities that are generally accessible to all residents, swimming pool, clubhouse, those could be counted potentially. So we're looking at different options, what can be counted. But golf course being more of a pay-to-play amenity that's not necessarily open would be potentially not included.
So I don't want to rush you, but we do have about 15 minutes.
Sure.
So I would just make sure you hit all the very important pieces.
Yep, we can do that.
As you try to conclude here.
Yep. So neighborhood commercial is similar to the SF2, not very well utilized zone. It's intended we're trying to focus it where it could be used in an infill type situation where someone's wanting to provide that neighborhood commercial. We don't envision it being widespread, but it could be an option on a limited basis. And in that essence, we're reducing the setbacks where it's more of a neighborhood scale, smaller buildings. And if there's questions on that, we can hit on those, but trying to kind of get through some of the main points. General commercial, not proposing major changes, just tweaking the front setback from 25 to 20, just giving a little bit more usable land, as well as encouraging parking lots to be behind the buildings in a more visually, I think, aesthetically appealing design. Some of the other zone districts were central business, just pointing out that's not really included in this update, as we want to do more outreach to the DDA and the downtown business owners to get their engagement. So we're not touching that at the moment. We're looking at adding an agricultural holding zone, which would be for properties that are annexed. They don't necessarily want to develop immediately, that they want to remain agricultural. So that would just be an option for those properties. Those are the highlights on that one. And planned unit development, to get into this a little more, as a reminder, it's that negotiated zone that we have concerns with widespread use of it due to the resources for implementing it, and then approval and then implementation. The intent of PUDs are to allow greater flexibility, and rather than continuing to rely on that, we've introduced the RMU2 and SF2 as hopefully alternatives. And we had originally proposed eliminating the PUD as an option for new development. After the stakeholder feedback we received, we've decided to keep the PUD as an option, but really trying to make it where it's only needed in the most rare of instances when it's truly an innovative design. So we're just looking at how we do that. I don't have exact answers for that, other than that's kind of ongoing. Finally, the setback and height exceptions are not well defined in the code currently. So things like decks or patios, porches, stairs, what can and cannot be in a setback. We're just trying to have those clearly defined in tables. And same thing for height, allowing elevator shafts or radio towers, satellite dishes, not radio towers, things of that nature. So next steps would be based on input tonight, as well as from stakeholders. We'll incorporate any modifications and bring this back to you if there are significant changes, otherwise move forward with it. We'll be bringing other articles to you in similar work sessions, such as the subdivision standards and future dates. And then our goal is to have all of those different components back for a comprehensive ordinance adopting those components by the end of the year. It's going to be a challenge, but that's what we're shooting for. And finally, questions, discussions.
So if you don't hear any additional input tonight or requested changes, you'll adopt what you have here for your Article 5 changes. But then we would have, I guess, a final time to take a look at this towards the end. But you kind of want to get a sense of, or now, if people are in on what you proposed to date.
Exactly,
Is that
yes.
right?
Yeah, if we're on track on anything better than done now, then we're on.
How widely attended was the stakeholder come to Jesus? How you had?
So we emailed everything out to our frequent developers, asked them to give us comments back. We heard back from a couple of those with concerns, and they're included in your packet materials of what their concerns were. It's kind of a cover letter outlining some of their concerns. So not widely attended, I guess.
The only reason I'm saying that is because in the past, we had, one developer speak out and 50 others didn't say anything, and then,
I think this could be similar, where one or two are highly engaged and the rest are not as engaged. We did hear from, I guess, one saying these are positive changes, not a lot of comments to add.
My really concern is about the setbacks in the back. Currently 5 feet, talking 15, some of the building. Back in the 90s, when I was in Loveland, there was a problem. They did something similar. And when two develops, they would send them side by side. They had to change the fencing, it could only be 4 foot. They had to bump it up to 6. You had people having to change their fences because when the new development in, they were so close together. And there were problems that couldn't be resolved where you just had somebody had like their main floor, like a split level, they had a deck. Then you had someone right there. I mean, they could literally see what the other person was having for dinner. So I guess just keep that, I mean, there's the addition thing, but, maybe we do think about, maybe 15 is too high, but maybe 10 or 12 is more appropriate. Just my input.
Well, before our next get-together, Alice, could you survey the surrounding towns with similar proposals to what you have here? And see what they do, and if they do the same thing?
Regarding the rear setback?
Well, the smaller lot sizes, the rear access, and just get an idea. I mean, if we're trying to stay in a competitive environment.
Sure.
And nobody else is doing it, then, do we need to do it?
Right. Yeah, I can come back with more of that research, but I do know off the top of my head, Fort Collins, if anything, mandates some of that development. I think Loveland and Longmont have, with their recent code updates, have offered it as an option, but I can widen the scope and look at other places.
And isn't it true, Paul, that most of this language probably is based on language that we've gotten from some of our neighbors and other jurisdictions?
Correct, yeah.
So it is, I guess I don't think we're inventing it brand new, a lot of it.
Right.
Paul, and I said before, this is amazing work, and to have pulled this all together, it's really nicely outlined. Probably the only one that scares me the most is very dense, to create a code that allows for very dense construction. And I think Scott said that would really be up to the developer to apply for that type of zoning. Well, I think we have to have some guardrails around that. What if they all ask for that type of zoning? And then we danced around whether we require open space or not, because it will impact, the result will be just as expensive a home, but smaller, and a smaller lot, if we require open space. But I think that high density development, just think in terms of guardrails to make sure we don't get stuck with a whole lot of
Yeah, we can definitely get more information on the density to you. And just to be clear, the open space would be required. It's just a matter of what level, how much.
Is there anything else, anything from planning commission, any final comments? I think you heard everything that everybody expressed, so you can just kind of keep that as, you know, in the back of your mind as you move forward.
All right?
Thank you. Great work, Paul, let's everybody, you know, I know this is, you know, we take our planning people to the curb and staff taking the step on has been a lot of work, but I just want to recognize these guys for everything that's done as far. No, don't get too much credit. And he got a haircut.